All right, everyone. It is noon Eastern time. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Adele White. I'm with Healthcare Education and Training. I'm so glad that y'all are here today to chat with us. Thank you for joining us for a treatment that fits, building the right system for youth substance use care. If that is the webinar you're attending today, you're in the right place. I'm just going to share a little bit about what HCT is before we get started. So we are a nonprofit that mission is to provide comprehensive sexual and reproductive health education and training to improve reproductive and sexual health outcomes. We are an organization of passionate people who are proactive in their belief that access to evidence-based, medically accurate reproductive health and sexual education, training, and care is a fundamental human right. So we are super excited today to have our guest speaker, who I'll introduce a little bit. I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping slides. Dr. Holvershorn, would you mind passing to the next slide? Awesome, thank you. So closed captions are available for this webinar if you need them. You could just click the little CC for live transcript at the bottom of your screen, and then you can click show subtitles and change your subtitle settings as you see fit. Next slide, please, Dr. Holvershorn. And then we will be using the Q&A function. If you have any question throughout the presentation, go ahead and click that Q&A button down at the bottom, and it will save your question, and then we will hold our questions till the end, and I will moderate. Dr. Holvershorn will be able to answer questions. So thank you for using the Q&A box throughout. Next slide, please. And we would love for you all to follow us on our social media platforms if you want to learn more about us. See what other kind of trainings we do. We're on Facebook and Instagram, and our website is hcet.org. Next slide, please. Let's see. So for just general housekeeping things, we always have an evaluation after each of our webinars. This is really just for us to learn what we're doing well, what we can improve on, and we would really appreciate it if you fill out an evaluation just to tell us how we're doing. They're really short, generally don't take more than 2 minutes. I'll place a link for the evaluation in the chat later in the webinar, and we'll have a QR code at the end. You'll also receive an email after this webinar to click the link if you'd like to fill out the evaluation. But we appreciate all of your feedback. If you have any technical difficulties during this webinar, go ahead and please email my coworker Jen, who's on this doing tech. Thank you, Jen, at updates@hcet.org. Next slide, please, Dr. Holvershorn. And now's the fun part. Now I get to introduce you to our wonderful presenter for today. So Dr. Leslie Holvershorn is a child and adolescent addiction psychiatrist, chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the IU School of Medicine, and is an active researcher and clinician, and has authored numerous publications on various topics in child psychiatry. She's received multiple grants to study the neurological basis of addiction risk in children. She's the director for Indiana's Department of Child Services Psychotropic Medication Consultation Program, and she serves as the consulting medical director for Indiana's Division of Mental Health and Addiction. So I am super excited to turn it over to you now, Dr. Holvershorn. We're excited to learn today.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. So we're going to talk about treating youth that have problems with substances. And I'll talk all about the work that we've done at Riley and IU where I work. So there we go. I don't really have any, I think, actual conflicts of interest here to disclose, but I do have funding for a variety of projects that I do from those sources. So we'll start off with the impact of substance use disorders. We'll talk about diagnosing, how common these disorders are, risk factors, what good treatment looks like, and that sort of thing. So I will just go ahead and get started. So substance use disorders are incredibly problematic for, around the world, but definitely in the United States. I just have a series of images and graphics to illustrate. If you think about folks who drive under the influence, the victims of those accidents, it's a leading cause of traffic fatality. There are many medical downsides to using drugs and alcohol, so much so that there's entire textbooks dedicated to those health issues. We know that when folks are struggling with substance use disorders, it's really hard to maintain productivity, both in the workplace, as a parent, as a family member. And so we see enormous costs. And that includes things like if people are incarcerated, that's very expensive. So this is a really old number. So I'm assuming it's only a much larger number now, probably in the trillions. But the estimated costs per year are, hundreds of billions of dollars. So it's hard to imagine anything that's more expensive than that, frankly. Um, and this image in the bottom there with the baby is kind of my reminder that the number one cause of parental neglect and maltreatment of their kids is substance use disorders. So if we could have an impact on substance use disorders in parents, that can have an enormous benefit for kids. And the graphic on the lower left is thinking about the developmental derailment that occurs when young people are using drugs of abuse. They sort of drop out of their normal lives and, end up just not making the gains in terms of, normal things that we'd expect adolescents to do, volunteering, being at school, having friendships. Some of those can be, impacted very dramatically by substance use disorders. So that's why I worry about them. So I work with youth, and that's my career dedication is understanding risk for substance use disorders and then how to treat them if someone does develop them. And part of that is because, or part of why I'm interested in youth is that by the time folks get into adulthood with serious substance use disorders, they become very hard to treat. Not impossible to treat, certainly worth pursuing treatment, but a lot of folks really struggle. And so this is from the Faces of Meth project, which takes mugshots, so publicly available photos of people who are engaged with the criminal justice system and just shows you how old they were at certain ages. And this woman used methamphetamine, and you can see she died when she was 38 years old. She looks like she's like 80 years old when she's 37. You can see how emaciated she is. And honestly, even at age 28, she looks quite a bit older than 28, in my opinion. So if we were to go back in time in her life when she was maybe 12, 13, 14, I would guess if she's like most folks that have serious substance use disorders in adulthood, that she was beginning to dabble with cigarettes, alcohol, maybe cannabis at that age. And so if someone could have intervened at that point, you can imagine that maybe she wouldn't have gone on to use methamphetamine, which ultimately killed her. So our interest today is thinking about what are those interventions, what are those strategies that we can think about when young people are, 12, 13, 14, 15, et cetera, up to 18, that really have, the point of it is to treat whatever problems they have then, but it really has a strong preventive benefit because, if you can decide you don't want to use drugs of abuse at that age, then you might not even be dabbling, in methamphetamine when you're in your 20s. So that's our focus. This slide just has a lot of reminders for me. So one thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is that the suicide actually is highly correlated with substance use. So most people who die by suicide do so while they're intoxicated. It's just harder to move forward without being disinhibited, from, alcoholism, the most common one. So, but even more generally than just that moment when people attempt suicide, in general, depression and other mental illness track right along with substance use. So they're just related to each other. And people who are abstinent from substances, who go into recovery are actually also less likely to have mental health problems as well. Um, we know that, and again, they're bidirectionally related, so it's hard to argue one causes the other, but in a lot of research studies, it does seem that the mood disorder or other mental illness, typically mood disorder, occurs more often before the onset of substance use disorders. So, the hypothesis is that people are struggling with their mental illness, and one of the strategies they use is to use substances, or maybe it's just harder to avoid them, when they're not as functional because of their mental illness. Um, And then I think sometimes people think that adolescents are like, if they don't really have drug problems, like they're just kids. How could they have a drug problem? And in fact, sort of by definition, if you meet criteria for a substance use disorder, and we'll talk about what that means, that means you're functionally struggling. So most adolescents, by definition, with substance problems, are having really pretty significant interference with their, with whether they're working, with their school, with their emotions. And they have all the symptoms that adults have, in order to meet criteria for the disorder. Sadly, fewer than 8% of adolescents with substance use disorders actually get treatment. And so that's a very small number. If you can, I always think, what if that was cancer? We would be outraged. We would not stand for that, right? Like, oh my gosh, fewer than 10% of kids with cancer get treatment. That would be appalling, right? Well, it is appalling, and it's the same, it's the same concern, because these disorders are actually more lethal than any other medical cause of illness. These are major contributors to death and morbidity in adolescents. So this is a real problem. This is something our team works on a lot at Riley, finding treatment resources. And I think the bottom line is there is not adequate funding through the Medicaid program to keep treatment programs open in a continuous way. And so they close. And so, for example, the program that I direct at Riley, we receive some state funds, and IU Health actually just subsidizes our program because we lose lots of money every day because the reimbursement is so low for care for substance use disorders. And I think that's just society tolerates it. These are very stigmatized disorders. We're not outraged about it as voters, as citizens. So that's what we see. And the final point here on this slide is relates to cannabis and psychosis and their link. So psychosis is a term that means symptoms that you might see with schizophrenia, and there's other ways to become psychotic. Drugs can cause psychosis, but not entirely existing in reality. So this could be hallucinations, delusions, like beliefs that, someone is monitoring your brain from the CIA, or aliens, or, listening into your conversations or something like that. So just not real things, but you believe they're real. And people develop psychosis at much higher rates when cannabis is being used. And this is definitely especially true for younger people. So adolescents, especially true under the age of 14. It's almost like, I don't want to say guaranteed, but incredibly risky to use cannabis under the age of 14. And even actually, one of our medical students found a recent publication that was showing the rates of psychosis, even in adult users now, is really high, like approaching 30%. So, and that is all related to the fact that cannabis is much more potent now than it has ever been. And so it is a much more dangerous drug than it has ever been. And so individuals can develop not just brief periods of being psychotic, but lifelong diagnoses of schizophrenia related to cannabis use. So it's a really scary issue. And actually, a young man died in Indianapolis, I think in Brownsburg, a couple of weeks ago because his cannabis was laced with fentanyl. He didn't even know, I think, that. So, and we'll talk about fentanyl, but cannabis is by no means healthy or harmless. Um, so we'll start with the statement at the bottom. So of people who begin drinking alcohol before age 14, about half of them become dependent on alcohol at some point in their life, whereas only 9% of people who start drinking at age 21 later become dependent. So there's tons of research that your brain, when you're young, when you're a child, is very different and very susceptible to drugs of abuse. And so it actually creates the risk, it worsens risk for later substance use if an individual is exposed at a younger age to whether it's alcohol, cocaine, cannabis, and nicotine, any of those. And that's been shown in many animal studies and many human studies. So definitely better to wait. That's a really good message for people, because a lot of people don't want to hear, you can never do this, but we really would be better off waiting. That's a very, very reasonable and safe recommendation. And then this image here of these brains come from a group in San Diego, California. There's a researcher named Susan Tappert, and her students one day came to her and said, "Hey, we want to put some kids who aren't heavy alcohol users, but they've done a little bit of binge drinking in their lives, in the scanner and compare them to kids who've never done binge drinking. And she said, no, that's a waste of time. Like a little bit of binge drinking is no big deal. You're not going to find any effect in the brain. Well, anyway, her students won out. They did it, and actually see these little red lines. Those indicate differences between the groups, between the kids who had done binge drinking and the kids who hadn't. And these are in white matter tracks. So these are like the fatty parts of the brain that are like the superhighways for information processing. So the information travels really quickly. And so the fatty part on the neurons is called myelin. And so the red part is where there's problems with the microstructure of the myelin. So it's like degraded. And the only difference between these groups of kids were that some of them had done a very minor amount of binge drinking and the others had done none. And so I think it's just a really interesting illustration that binge drinking is like what I would call the normative way of drinking, meaning it's very common among young people. It's just how it works in the United States. So you go out and drink, 4, 5, 6 or more drinks, maybe even way more. And that's not, that's pretty typical, right? For maybe college, high school students. And I think this illustrates that it's not as safe as we thought. Like it does have consequences in terms of brain development. Okay, so why should we care about, adolescents misusing substances? I've already covered this first point, right? That if the earlier we use, the more likely we are to have problems later on. The adolescent brain is just more sensitive to the toxicity of drugs and alcohol compared to the adult brain, and whether those are cognitive impairments or psychiatric problems. And then adolescence is a really important part of time. Like I'm 48 right now, and I think like frankly, not that much is very different in my life between 38 and 48. It's not this incredible period of change. Whereas, 13 to 18, think about how different, that period is, how much more an 18-year-old can do in the world compared to a 13-year-old. And so that's a really bad time to miss out on development. And so that's the period we're talking about. And that's just like almost like the worst time you could throw off your cognitive development or your ability to, have social development because it's so important to set you up for adulthood. Okay. So what are some warning signs we look for when we're seeing young people? Some of these are kind of obvious, but I just think they're worth noting. So individuals who are trying to seek out prescription drugs or any other drugs, whether it's vaping or cannabis, like probably they have a problem. Like very few people can use these drugs just, in a healthy, not no pro non-problematic way. And so if you see signs of the seeking out behaviors, that's concerning. Odds are if a young person spends time with other people that use drugs, they use as well, regardless of what they might say. Like that's what the science says. There's a lot of research that kids who are not supervised in their free time are much more likely to have problems with drugs of abuse. And that's one of the greatest predictors of whether or not someone can have drug problems. So structured activities that involve adult supervision are very protective against drug abuse. Actually, there's been tons of research on like the 4-H program. Has like really strong benefits, supervised sports, music activities, things like that. But kids kind of on their own with no adults around for extended periods of time tends to lead to more drug use. Um, there are some people in the world who do not tolerate discomfort well. And I'm not saying that's their fault. That may be like the genetics of their brain chemistry. But they want a medication for every symptom. So they don't like it when they're tired. They don't like it when they can't sleep. They don't like it when they're upset and their stomach hurts, whatever. And people who take a lot of medications and who don't tolerate discomfort well are just more likely to develop drug problems, in part just because they're exposed to more drugs, but there's an element of like learning to tolerate discomfort is just an important part of being a human. And if that's hard for you, you might be just more willing, you can't hang in there. You need an opioid, you need a sleeping pill or something like that. So those folks are more at risk. Obviously, anyone using drugs, potentially could have a problem, right? And then folks who are seeking out substances get upset when they can't find them. So in my context, I'm a psychiatrist. So if someone's asking me for Xanax and throwing a fit and yelling at me because I won't give it to them, that's a good sign that there's something wrong there in terms of their need for Xanax. Um, because usually, if you don't get an antibiotic, you're like, well, I don't feel good, but people aren't, absolutely losing it. So that's a good signal. And then substance use disorders are highly genetic, right? So DNA, codes for proteins. Proteins are what make up parts of the brain and the rest of the body. And the brain function is really what drives substance use disorders. And so these are highly genetic, and they run through families. And I think everyone, who's known a family where lots and lots of people have had drug problems or died from drug or alcohol problems, you can see that. But these are very, so if you hear a story of, I've had three uncles die from alcoholism, I really get nervous for that person, because if we're you'd really want to be thinking about prevention, because they just have an elevated risk. So, how are substance use disorders different in adolescents compared to adults? So, adults are usually using for a long time, right? And they've changed their brains as a result over many years of use. So, adolescents, fortunately, they're less chronic. They haven't used so long. They're easier to treat. It's easier to come off of these drugs because they haven't used for so long. And they very rarely have withdrawal symptoms that are as severe as adults, especially with alcohol. You almost never see alcohol withdrawal in young people. You certainly can see opioid withdrawal even from just a few weeks use. Cannabis withdrawal is a milder withdrawal syndrome anyway, but in general, withdrawal is not as dangerous. Adults with alcohol withdrawal can die from it. They have to be in the ICU sometimes. It's a really serious condition, whereas we just very rarely see that in adolescents. But adolescents, like I said before, can be very severely affected. They need treatment just like adults do. Unfortunately, there are way fewer resources for adolescents. They're just, we sometimes do secret shopper calls where we pretend to be a family just to find out who will take adolescent patients. And there are very few resources around our state and other states. But the good news is we do have more oversight from authorities. So sometimes we can have parents involved who are trying to help. We can school personnel, child welfare folks. So there's a lot of additional benefits that we can gain by having those other individuals involved. And then adolescents tend to are more opportunistic, I like to say. They just use what they can find because they don't always have the resources like transportation and money to get whatever their drug of choice is. So the bad side is sometimes what's available is more dangerous, like inhalants. If you really want a drug, you don't have any money, you don't have a car, well, you can always go steal some Axe body spray from the drugstore and use that. And that's actually a very dangerous thing to do. Whereas if you were an adult, you'd say, what I really want is cannabis, and I'm going to go. Now, that has changed a lot with Snapchat. So, Snapchat is actually now the number one source of drugs of abuse for people, and especially young people. And the majority of overdose deaths in the United States are attributed to drugs that were purchased on Snapchat. So that has changed a lot in the last couple of years. And so actually adolescents are able to get their drug of choice more readily than in the past. Okay. So how common are drug problems? So this is kind of interesting. I think what I'm going to say might surprise you. So while it is true that, lots of youth will try a drug here or there, and the data is about half may try a drug before they graduate. And remember, that's half who didn't try a drug also, totally drug naive. About 8% meet criteria for like a serious problem. That number is actually lower than it has been for many decades. So way fewer young people are using drugs of abuse now than in the 90s, in the 80s, in the 70s, and then the 60s. So that's good news. A lot of young people are saying, no, thank you. I get that this isn't good for me. But the problem is in the United States, because we have so much fentanyl in our communities, the death rate has actually gone up a lot. So way fewer adolescents are using now, but way more are dying because it's so lethal. It was interesting. I was on a call with some research colleagues in Amsterdam the other day, and they were like, "Yeah, we don't have fentanyl." Like, wow, you're lucky, because that is a big problem here for us. So death rate is higher, but actually fewer adolescents have been using decade on decade, maybe related to drug abuse prevention. I certainly see a phenomenon of like they're watching adults around them struggle and suffer with drug abuse, and they're like, no thanks, I don't want to repeat that. But nonetheless, that's good. And certainly we know alcohol is trending towards a lot of, mocktails and alcohol-free beers. And so a lot of folks are saying, I just don't even want the effects of alcohol in my life, which health-wise is really good news. But we still see a very, very high mortality rate. It did get better in 2024. I don't know if you've seen articles about that. It was really terrible, kind of 2021, 22, 23, really peaked during that time, but did get a little bit better in 24. And that we think has mainly to do with the cartels modifying their formulas so that the fentanyl is less potent. I mean, certainly there have been a lot of efforts of, naloxone distribution and things, but most likely it was the cartels realizing they're not, they can't kill off their customer base, and they became more sophisticated with testing their products. Okay. So you may have heard of the gateway drug hypothesis that there are certain drugs that lead to other drugs, and it is definitely the case that there are drugs that certain drugs you start with and you move to that typically people don't start with the most serious drug. However, really what it is the gateway drugs are the drugs around you, and so alcohol and tobacco and marijuana are often called gateway drugs, but there is good research that the gateway drugs are whatever people can access. So if it's easier to access inhalants, that'll be the gateway drug. If it's easier to access fentanyl, that'll be the gateway drug. So historically, these are the gateway drugs, but it really is just that they're easier to access. And so that's why they've been called that. So some of the problems we face, and this every year I do this talk, I have to redo this slide because it's different in 2021 versus 2025, So, but for quite a while now, we've lived in a phase in our country where the public views cannabis as not dangerous. So people think it's safe, it's no big deal. And that changes from decade to decade. But right now, we live in a period where the cannabis industry is very powerful. They have really gained a lot of control in the state legislatures. Many states are, legalized cannabis for both, recreational or medicinal use. By the way, the medical science backing that up is very weak. So in general, people perceive that this is fine, and so therefore cannabis rates are very high. I mean, people use a lot of cannabis. Vaping is the primary way of inhaling nicotine products and increasingly cannabis products. So vaping is, really taken over. Almost no one smokes combustible cigarettes anymore in the young, among young people. And then fentanyl is, so it's a lab-derived, lab-created opioid that is incredibly potent. And so the way it works is it binds to different parts of your body, but in your brain, it binds to your brainstem, which is, if you imagine, like very low in your kind of just at the top part of your neck sits this little thing that connects down to the spinal cord. The brain's on top here. So it's one of the most primitive parts of the brain. All animals have it, and the brain, one of the brainstem's functions is to breathe. And so you don't think about breathing because your brainstem is doing it for you. It moves your diaphragm up and down, and so we all breathe about 14 times a minute. And what fentanyl does is it attaches and affects the brainstem's ability to breathe. And so if you get when you start off with a drug, with a fentanyl or other opioid overdose, your breathing gradually slows. So instead of breathing 14 times a minute, you might breathe 10 times a minute, and then you're breathing 5 times a minute. And if you're unconscious, because that medicine is also sedating, or maybe you've used it with something else like Xanax that's sedating, you don't know that you're breathing slow, right? So if you were awake, you would say, whoa, I'm going to force myself to breathe faster. And you can do that. But if you're unconscious, you're not aware that you're breathing very, very rarely. And eventually you get to a place where you're maybe breathing 1 time a minute, and that's just not enough oxygen headed into your brain, into your heart, into your other organs. And so your organ systems start to die off if it goes long enough. The good news is because that process takes some time, if you find someone that's down, you can administer naloxone, which bumps those opioids off the brainstem receptors and allows them to wake up and start breathing again. So it's a very effective treatment because the death associated with fentanyl is kind of slow and you have some time to catch them. But the sad thing is sometimes you catch people and they've already had very severe brain damage before you catch them, but they still live. So that's how that works. Methamphetamine remains, a problem in certain areas. We're actually doing a methamphetamine treatment trial right now, and we're having no problem recruiting for it. So it's way less common in adolescents, though. So much more of a young adult phenomenon. and actually very popular among men having sex with men. So kind of a sex enhancing drug. So that's what we see it used a lot for in Indianapolis. Um, yeah. So, and that figure here at the bottom just shows that if you don't perceive cannabis to be risky, then you're much more likely to use it, right? Which makes sense. Okay, so what are the risk factors in general? So we've actually known for quite a long time that it's really complicated to figure out who's going to have problems with drugs. Part of it is like societal beliefs, right? Like I was talking about with cannabis, so we call that the macro system. A lot of it has to do with like what your individual community is. Are drugs around? Are they easy to find? Are your neighbors using them? Your friends using them? What's the media telling you about them? And then, within your family, these are the most predictive things. So in your home, are people using drugs? Do you have the genetic risk as an individual for drugs of abuse? Are there other things pulling you away from drug use into more positive things that don't involve drugs? Are you active in your community? That would be protective, right? So all those things contribute ultimately to whether or not someone uses drugs. So there's many places to intervene and prevent drug use. We know that, as I've said like four times now, the earlier you use, the more likely you are to have drug problems. So keeping people away, the longer the better. I sometimes have patients who are 9 and 10 years old. They've been not supervised as children and had access to drugs, and they are very, very hard to work with because it's very tough for them to stop using drugs of abuse. Like I mentioned, genetics are huge. 80% of the variance between people is explained by genetics. I think I like to hear that because I think people sometimes feel like they're bad people because they have substance use. And when you tell them, well, it's kind of genetic, it's like, yeah, just like, diabetes is very genetic and, glaucoma and all these medical things that we don't feel bad about. Same thing here. There are certain psychiatric disorders. You might have heard of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. Conduct disorder is a disorder where kids break a lot of rules and get in a lot of trouble. Oppositional defiance, like a milder form of that. We lump those together in the field and call them externalizing disorders. Depression, anxiety, those also are risk factors, PTSD. And then there's, like I mentioned, a lot of environmental moderators, like who the peer group is. That's very important. Childhood stressors and adversity can predispose to all these conditions, availability of drugs, and participating in, if you're someone who doesn't mind breaking the rules, and in fact, you like breaking the rules, you like that excitement, those folks are more at risk. There's a scientific term in the literature for kids who are very, very high risk, and those are the kids I recruit into my research studies. They're called neurobehavioral disinhibition is the name. Okay. So when you go see like a therapist or a psychiatrist for substance use disorder treatment, the first thing they need to do is figure out if you have a disorder. And so we use the American Psychiatric Association puts out this big book. It's a big purple book, and it has the criteria, and we're on version 5 of it right now. So what it means is we have to have some of these symptoms occurring over a certain period of time. So actually, it's quite easy to meet criteria for a substance use disorder. You need only 2 symptoms from this list to get a mild use disorder, and then it goes up from there. So, and that was intentional on the part of the American Psychiatric Association because they found that even mild use disorders were associated with health risks. And so they wanted people to be aware that even a little bit of drug problem is bad for their health. And so that's why that has changed. So it used to be harder to meet criteria, but now it's actually pretty, if you're using drugs, probably you have a problem based on these criteria. So what the criteria are, number one, if you use a substance more than you intended to, or you're using it longer than you meant to. So your use is a little out of control. Like you're like, I'm just going to have one beer and gosh, I had 6, that kind of thing. Um, no, the second one is you're trying to stop, like you want to stop, but it's really hard to. You can't is how it feels. The third thing is experiencing cravings or urges when you're not using the substance. And so this is a really important question I'm always asking my patients because that's a big driver of their behavior. If they're craving something, they're going to be focused on that and they're not going to be doing, what else they should be doing in their lives, right? This fourth one here is called tolerance. So it's you start off getting a buzz from one beer. A month later, you need 3 beers to get the same buzz. 2 months later, you need 5 beers to get the same buzz. So you just need to get more and more and more. So people start using more and more to get the feeling that they're looking for. Number five is withdrawal symptoms. Again, some drugs are just more prone to those than others, but in general, not a great sign if you see withdrawal symptoms. And then this one's, I think, really hallmark. People are spending a lot of time using the drug, getting the drug, recovering from the drug. It kind of takes over their life, right? So it's all about the drug, whether it's, recovering from it, using it, etc. And it takes over, and it doesn't leave room for relationships and work and parenting, and so you can see why people become impaired as a result. Number seven is people are neglecting their responsibilities because they're doing all the things that we have mentioned in number six. Number eight, they continue to use even when it causes relationship problems. So people will say, you've got to stop using dad, you've got to stop using brother, whatever. And, and they continue, right? Because their reward circuitry has been in their brain, has been hijacked, and their motivational circuitry. So they are just focused on the drug. So even though they want to stop, or they realize it would be better to stop, they find that they just can't in a consistent way. So a bad sign when you see people giving up desirable social or recreational activities, things they want to be doing, they stop doing. And number 10, using substances in a risky way. So like in a car, or doing things that, result in having danger, resulting in danger. And then number 11, just continuing to use despite knowing that these drugs are causing physical problems, or maybe not even knowing, like but they're causing physical problems, or they're causing mental health problems. So all of those are signs that the use is a problem. And so we would call those, again, it could be a mild, a moderate, or severe use disorder, depending on how many criteria somebody meets. So when a psychiatrist, psychologist, some sort of clinician is asking, it's really important that we ask about each drug separately. So for example, you could have a mild use disorder with cannabis, but a severe use disorder with opioids. And maybe 3 years ago, you had a moderate use disorder with alcohol, but now you're in remission, right? So it matters. The diagnosis is given, and it would actually be you have an alcohol use disorder mild, you have a cannabis use disorder severe, and a past, whatever in hallucinogen use disorder. Um, the way I like to teach our learners to ask about this is, if you're in a setting where you think it's very likely that someone's using, rather than saying, do you use drugs? You just say, tell me the last time you used cocaine. Tell me the last time you used alcohol, just to like let them, we're no judgment here. I just want to know what you're using so we can help you. And then it's very important to find out who's supplying the drug, because sometimes, it's an older brother and he's in the house. And so you need to have a conversation with the parent about, fixing that. But that's an important thing. And then it's really important to figure out how much they use and how often they use. So, and we actually have a blank calendar, and it's called a timeline follow back, where you literally are like, okay, your dad's birthday party was on Tuesday and you had 2 joints there. How about the day after that? And you kind of fill in the whole month. And then each time they come in for their session, we're looking to fill that in again. And so we could say you had a 74% reduction in your alcohol use over this month, or a 26% reduction. And so you can get really specific, because abstinence is really hard to achieve early on. And so we really want to highlight any win that we can. And so if it's a big reduction in use, that's a health win. That's a success. And so we need to be able to track that very specifically. Um, so if you're a parent, or a healthcare provider or somebody, what can you say? I think a really safe option is always just, it's better not to use substances. You can always say this. And then if you want to give medically, it's also reasonable to give medically accurate and developmentally appropriate education. Now we'll talk in a little bit about how that can sometimes be off-putting to adolescents. So we don't always take that stance, but if you want some pretty good research-based facts to share that are kind of targeted at teenagers, there's teens.drugabuse.gov is a good site for just, good information. So that was like the advice giving, fact giving stance that you can sometimes have. I would say most of the time, though, in the drug treatment world, we're actually in the motivational interviewing stance. So this is a style of interacting with someone where you're trying to elicit change. So, of course, the change we want is we want them to decide that they don't want to use drugs, right? That's our goal. And this actually, this style of interviewing, style of interacting came from the drug abuse research world, but it's been applied in like any setting you can imagine. So like during COVID with vaccine hesitancy, healthcare workers are being trained on motivational interviewing to help convince people to get vaccinated. You could be a personal trainer trying to motivate your clients to exercise more, and you could use motivational interviewing. You could be a diabetes doctor trying to get people to monitor their blood sugars better, and you could use motivational interviewing. So it's the science of behavioral change. And it's collaborative, it's person-centered, meaning it's all about their goals. And you're just guiding them in a way that you're trying to elicit a change from within them. You're not scolding them or telling them what they need to do, but you want them to be motivated to change their behavior. So you can, and this can be used both with adolescents, caregivers, friends, a variety of folks, and it can be used in like in my case, I'm a medication doctor. Psychiatrists are typically prescribing medications, but it doesn't mean I can't use motivational interviewing. I can do it for a few minutes. I could be a guidance counselor using it. I could be a parent using it. And I will say it's not super easy to do. It requires a lot of training. You can go, there's all kinds of trainings online. You want to find a trainer that's called Mint certified. That's like the national certifying body. And it takes time to get good at. Some people are naturally like they already act that way around other people, so it's easy for them to learn. Other people don't. But it's just a style of interaction. And the assumption, and this is a really important point, maybe the most important point of the talk, people assume, and it's true, that adolescents are not necessarily ready to change, right? So we find someone who's using a lot of cannabis or fentanyl, we want them to stop as their parent or their teacher. They don't want to stop. Um, that's okay. Bring them to treatment anyway. They don't need to be ready to stop. They don't need to have hit rock bottom. They just need to be able to get in the door physically, and we'll do the rest. We'll use the motivational interviewing. So, motivational interviewing assumes that people don't want to change. It assumes they aren't interested in coming into treatment and they don't want to quit. And we don't care. That's fine. That's normal. That's why we use motivational interviewing. So, I often see families say, well, Bobby, we caught you smoking. Are you willing to go in? Will you do this? And I'm like, don't ask him. Just bring him. Just get him here. And we'll use the motivational interviewing. We'll work with you parents on ways to motivate him. I mean, yeah, we'd like, we'll use a style that's engaging with them. We want him to feel good about coming, but I don't think you need to feel that people have to themselves be ready for treatment. That's like an old way of thinking about treatment. Um, if you ever want to read a book about motivational interviewing with adolescents, this is a good one. I make our medical students read this when they rotate with me. But some of the themes in motivational interviewing are that adolescents are really interested in autonomy, right? They want a car, they want a job, they want their own place, they want their own stuff, they want their own phone, right? And that's all autonomy. And that's great. So we harness that. All right, in order to get that to the place where your mom's going to trust you to take the car out again, you know and so it's like, I wonder if I didn't use weed, if she'd let me drive. Ooh, interesting, let's talk about that, right? So that's one of the motivators. It's also a collaborative relationship. We're not scolding anyone, we're not their vice principal, we're not yelling at them. We're partnered with them. We're not going to give up on them if they have a slip or a relapse. We're working together because we want the same goals, right? We want them to have that autonomy, we want them to be safe, and they feel that like we're on their team, we're on their side. And then what folks who are using motivational interviewing do a lot of is they work to help elicit regions for and concerns about change. And so think of change as people being on a continuum. And my motivation to change around a certain thing might be 10 one day on a scale of 1 to 10. It might be 1 someday. So we're always talking about like, where's your motivation to change today? Oh, a 4. Okay. What would it take to get it to a 6, do you think? Or why do you think it's a 4 this week and last week it was a 7? So it's this fluid thing that we're constantly exploring and probing with them, and they're learning a lot about what's motivating them and what's not. And so it's very tempting to argue with adolescents, try to persist and convince them. We all do it. I do it as a parent. It's just hard not to. But it's really, in terms of using motivational interviewing, not a good strategy. So we're not going to get into arguments about whether or not drugs are good for you or bad for you. We call it stop, dropping, and rolling. We're just going to change topics, move on. Okay, next, it's just not going to be a battle. We're going to come back to that next week, that kind of thing. We use a lot of reflections. So it sounds like you think that if you were running track and not smoking weed, you'd be faster, that kind of thing. So I'm reflecting on what you're saying and all sorts of strategies. We're not arguing with them about things. We're not correcting it, and we're not persuading them. We emphasize, there's all these strategies that you can use. You can see them listed here in blue. But if you want to read more about it, it's an interesting way of working with people that helps motivate them to change. Here's another tool. I actually think this website is no longer active, but you can still find the resource. It exists. So it's called the Family Checkup. It's literally a quiz that families take, and it spits out some recommended strategies. And they tend to be around these 5 principles. And this is what good family therapy for substance use disorders would focus on. Basically, improving communication. It tends to be the case that adolescents with substance use are getting scolded a lot. They're in trouble. Everyone's yelling at them. So working towards more positive style, but also, encouraging them when they have some wins, some reasonable negotiations. But then a big part of this is setting limits. So no, it's not safe for you to be driving the car right now. I need you to, sorry, lots of things popping on my screen. Let me get rid of them. You have to be abstinent from drugs before you do that. So empowering caregivers to be able to set limits, and do it clearly and safely, and then supervised time. So I need to know where you are. I need to know what you're doing. I need to know who you're with. And so families often need to be tuned up in all of these areas. And this report kind of spits out the strategies they can use and which ones they need to prioritize. All right. And again, I know that this is probably not an audience full of therapists, but these are some of the names of the therapies that are really effective for adolescent substance use. I think the bad news is it's very hard to find them in the state of Indiana. But this is if you opened up a textbook and tried to read about what works in the literature, this is what works. Yeah, anyway, that's a list, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of these. There are places you can find lists online of the types of treatments that are effective. But in general, cognitive behavior therapy is a very solid approach. So this is the idea that there are thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Think of a triangle: thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and they all are influenced by drugs, right? So you can have some distorted thoughts like, "Oh, this isn't too bad for me to use cocaine." Well, is that true? Like, let's examine that thought. Behaviors are, behaviors, right? So like drug seeking behavior. And then emotions, right? I feel really relaxed when I use cannabis and it helps me escape from the PTSD symptoms that I'm having or whatever. So that's a good CBT therapist would do something called a functional analysis early on in treatment that is literally like a dissection of what the motivations are for someone to use drugs and what is it that's driving that use. And it may be several things. Sometimes I feel so cool when I'm using drugs because I know the cool kids are using them and I want to be seen as a cool person. Sometimes I have terrible PTSD because of something that happened and I'm unhappy and sad and I want to escape from my life. Okay. Sometimes I just love the thrill of it. I love the feeling of it. And it could be 5 different things. And sometimes it's one and the other. But if we start identifying those causes, then we can work on removing some of the risk factors. Like, oh, okay, we could treat your PTSD so you're not suffering from that anymore. Or it's often, let's treat your depression, let's treat your PTSD, let's treat your anxiety. Those sorts of things can be really helpful. And then there are, unfortunately, things like 12-step programs and just sort of vague drug counseling are not found to be very effective. I'm not opposed to the idea of an AA or an NA. It's just hard to find them for adolescents, and they are thought to be more effective for adults. But there are sometimes supportive folks like peer recovery coaches that could work with people after they've done a course of treatment. But just going to like AA would not be a course of treatment. That would not be like one of these things here under works well established. Contingency management is an interesting thing that can be used to help with substance use. It's basically giving people prizes for doing what we want them to do. So we have a contingency management program active at Riley. It's a very well researched modality that's very helpful. And basically what we are incentivizing is we want them to come to sessions. We want them to come to see their therapist, see their doctor. We want them to not use drugs of abuse, right? So we're going to test their urine or test their breathalyzer, whatever, make sure they're not using. That's our goal, for them to be totally abstinent if they can. And then we want them to rebuild their life to be full of joyful, connected experiences with other people that don't involve drugs of abuse. So and they get to choose what that would be. That might mean volunteering at the Humane Society or joining the marching band again or playing soccer or whatever it is. And so they're given assignments each week in therapy to go try 3 of those things. And if you're in therapy for 12 weeks, that's quite a few things you've tried. Maybe by the end of it, some of those will stick. and you've got some new friends or some new job or some new thing to focus on instead of drugs of abuse. And doing each of those things each day when they come in for a session actually allows for the drawing of a prize. So it's like a wheel of fortune. If you think of that show, you spin the wheel and you might land on small prize. You might land on no prize, but good job. You might land on jumbo prize. And so in our case, small prizes are worth about $5. I think medium prizes are about $10, and then the jumbo prize is $50. And so the more of these things you do, the more spins you get. And we give additional spends for sustaining abstinence and additional spends for the first time you've been abstinent. So this really helps adolescents get in the door to a program when they're not really wanting to be there. It helps with early motivation, and then it's designed to help them feel good about their successes, and they can walk out with a lot of money from participating in one of these programs. And so it's especially helpful early on in treatment when people are like, I don't want to be here. Well, you're going to get $20 because look what you did. You weren't using, and all these things. So it's a very effective modality. So a really good treatment program. The model we use at Riley is called Encompass. It includes all of these activities. I mentioned the functional analysis, but there's a lot of very, very well thought out strategies that are used that are extremely helpful in working with young people. And these are versions of this are also used in adults. So this is kind of state of the art of what you'd want to look at for high quality drug treatment. Family involvement is incredibly important. So any good substance treatment program should have a component there. We find that it's hard sometimes to get families to come to, like, we'd love to see them every week, but we require a minimum of 3 weeks. And they're working on some of those skills I mentioned, like limit setting and communication and effective monitoring. Here's some of the other things. So, getting substance use out of the house, problem solving supports, keeping everybody focused on the future orientation. This is great. He wants to graduate from high school. Let's support him. And you can get as deep as you can get. I mean, there's often many hours of work that can be done, but you meet families where they are. Sometimes I'm asked, what is really dangerous with drugs? Well, alcohol withdrawal is really dangerous for people, but it's very rare in adolescents. Benzodiazepines, so think of Xanax, Ativan. We learned about that from a popular show recently, lorazepam, right? Um, Klonopin, those are all benzodiazepines. And in withdrawal, so if someone's using heavy doses of those daily, pulling them away is dangerous. You can have seizures and even death. They work in the same system in the brain as alcohol, which is the GABA system. And then fentanyl is really dangerous. So even one dose of fentanyl can kill you. I've had very, very large young people I've seen use fentanyl one time and die. So, it's very dangerous. We want to have a lot of naloxone around. And I think the key message for healthcare providers is if someone shows up in our setting, in our healthcare setting, we really need to start them on a medication called buprenorphine, which stabilizes their craving, stabilizes their withdrawal, and then they continue to take it when they leave the emergency department. So we've gotten better and better at doing that at Riley. But it's still, like, in the pediatric community, not well understood how to treat these folks. So, um, anyway, I won't. There are medicines. These are some of the names of the medicines we use, but medicines can be very helpful in people being able to succeed and stop using drugs of abuse. Suboxone is another name for buprenorphine. Um, we also, have treatments for alcohol like naltrexone. You can also use naltrexone to treat opioids. And then we use a lot of nicotine replacement products to treat, vaping and nicotine use. You might hear the term medication-assisted treatment. That just means behavioral interventions plus medications. They're way less research than adults. What do people look like when they're intoxicated? You see pinpoint pupils in opioid intoxication. You'll see people, so I'm not talking about withdrawal, I'm talking about intoxication, right? So they're actively using, they might be really tired, their eyes are closed, they're breathing slowly. Their blood pressure is low, and they might, I don't know how often you would notice if someone's constipated, but it's sort of the opposite of withdrawal where people are having diarrhea. But that's your classic intoxication sign. So these folks would often be laying down. Their lips could be blue, right? If they're not getting enough breathing, they might be, they're having a hard time protecting their airway, gurgling, choking. And you're really interested in how often they're breathing. And so these are the people you want to give naloxone to. It's a spray in the nose, and it's not dangerous. So if you're wrong and they're not intoxicated with an opioid, it won't hurt them. I mean, I could literally spray it up my nose right now and no big deal. So it's no harm in trying. If you find someone who's unconscious, just go ahead and, try to wake them up, get 911 on the way, but go ahead and administer naloxone. And now with fentanyl the way it is, you may need to administer several doses. So we give our patients naloxone kits all the time when they're in, and we make sure the families have them around. And frankly, the idea is everybody maybe should have some in their backpack in case they come across somebody somewhere who's been intoxicated. Some people don't like the idea because they think it perpetuates drug use. And I really don't think that's why people are using drugs. I think there are much more complicated reasons than that. And so it can be quite life-saving and important. In terms of existing treatment models, historically, we've had substance treatment here and mental health treatment here. And so you have to go to two different places, which doesn't make a lot of sense because most people have both problems. It's exceedingly rare to find someone with a substance use disorder who doesn't also have a mental health issue. And so, really, best practice is to have both of them together. Get your depression treated at the same place as you can get your addiction treatment. So really good high quality treatment would include, what we've talked about with those different treatment models, close monitoring of substance use, case management, recovery supports, and then sort of getting people as they are recovering back into the workforce, addressing their mental health issues, their medical issues. Oftentimes they may need legal services, especially more in adulthood, support for their family. So it should be really comprehensive because, addiction can really devastate somebody's life, and they need a lot of support. We do have a hotline that we operate at Riley for the state of Indiana for people who are trying to care. So this is designed for like primary care doctors, emergency medicine doctors, social workers who are like in the presence of someone who needs help with their addiction, who's an adolescent and they're not sure what to do. So we get calls all the time from all around the state and we'll help you figure out what needs to happen. And if they need a treatment provider, we can step in or we can locate someone close to their community. It could often we're getting calls after overdoses, but it can be anytime. We get families calling all the time, which is fine. That's not what we designed it for, but we will never hang up the phone. We'll work with the family to get them what they need. And then so it's considered a provider to provider helpline. And we keep a very up-to-date database of all the treatment resources in the state because they literally change every day. Our medications, the right dose, what kind of treatment does this person need? Where can I find services? What do they need? And we will just step in and help. So that's the phone number. And actually, that's not IUPI anymore. It's IU.edu. Sorry. Yeah. So we've got a team of experts that are happy to help. And that's the name of the program. See it as AA Prog at IU. So feel free to call us if you find yourself needing to help someone. Whoops, I went the wrong direction there. The clinic that we run at Riley is called our Adolescent Dual Diagnosis Clinic. I would recommend just calling AAA because we can get into that more quickly. There's also a mental health version of the AAA program called Be Happy, Behavioral Health Access Program for Youth. Again, designed for not that one is really more strict on not for families. It's really for other healthcare professionals to get help for their patients. And there is an adult version. Sorry, this slide is messed up called CHAMP. We also are doing a lot of integrated care work, meaning treating mental health and substance use in the primary care setting. So if you know of people who are IU health patients, we can now comprehensively provide mental health care in the primary care setting, and we will escalate care to psychiatry for those kids who need it directly from primary care. So that is it. I just have a bunch of references, and then I think that's it. So happy to take questions or comments.
Thank you, Dr. Holvershorn. That was really, really good information. Yeah,
Good.
and perfect time. Wrapping up, we have a couple minutes for questions. So we have our QR code for our evaluation here. Folks can scan that if they want to. Also put a link in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and give you a question that came in. So, Dr. Holvershorn, can you expand more on how Snapchat is being used to locate drugs? Specifically, how students can identify a Snap user that is promoting/selling drugs and or where drugs are easily accessible on the Snap map. Do you have details on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I am not a Snapchat user myself, so I am just relying on what other people have told me. But my understanding is you can kind of type in something, and it seems that all of our patients can figure this out very quickly. So my guess is it's very easy to just search, and then they're able to find dealers. somehow. And I wish I knew more about, maybe I don't wish I knew more about it, but it is super easy. And I don't know if they ask their friends or what, but that is how, they're able to say I'm looking to score some M30s, for example, which is like the most common name for fentanyl in our area, and somehow that works easily in terms of finding someone that can deliver those. And I think because those messages, they're hard for law enforcement to track because the messages disappear.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's a good answer. I was actually wondering kind of the same thing. I'm gonna
Mhm.
put some resources in the chat that are people are interested because I also had kind of the same question.
Yeah.
Folks, feel free to drop in more questions. That's the one we have so far. I will go ahead and drop those links in the chat. We'll just wait to see if there's any other questions coming in. I also did drop the link to the evaluation in the chat box as well. So thank you all for taking the time to let us know what you liked about this webinar, what we can improve on. So there's three things in the chat. First, I have the evaluation link, and then two articles, one from NPR and one from Gab, on how young people or anyone really can use Snapchat to source drugs. I know one thing that Dr. Hovershorn was mentioning is that things go away, right? They're only temporary. Um, and that can include ads on Snapchat
Yeah.
that drug dealers might use. Anything else you want to let everybody know before we let you go, Dr. Hovershorn?
Um, I think just give us a call on the AAA line if you encounter anything concerning or need help. We're happy to connect. We want to get calls, so don't hesitate to throw that number in your phone. I can actually go back to that screen if you want.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
We're here. Yeah, the 278-8434. If you want to pop that in your phone, where we can address any or at least try to address any issue that you need help with.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr.
Yeah.
Hovershorn. I learned a ton. That was really,
Great.
really good. We appreciate you. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us as
Thank
well.
you. Okay.